Asylums. One of the many reasons why I'm glad I live in the timeline I currently live in, where I can talk openly about my ADHD and girl crushes without being, tossed into one against my will. I wouldn't have survived the Victorian era, I can tell you that much for certain. Question for you, would you have been admitted into an asylum back in the day? Let me know in the comments, and let's break down some ickiness together, folks. I'm kicking off today with something I didn't know until about an hour ago. Doctors gave patients malaria on purpose. Given the correlation between syphilis and the development of mental health symptoms, I guess it might be unsurprising that a lot of those committed, at the time, in asylums were infected with syphilis. But what is surprising is how the asylums of the era were like, let's figure out how to treat this. Specifically, Dr. Julius Wagner-Jauregg was the first to advocate for using malaria as a syphilis treatment. In the age before antibiotics, no reliable cure had been found for the devastating disease, and a lot of people were essentially tossing a dart at a board and seeing, what's gonna stick? Dr. Wagner was like, let's experiment with injecting malaria into the red fluid circulatory system of patients with syphilis, and probably did this without their knowledge or consent in the belief that the malarial parasites would kill the agent of syphilis infection. And what do you know, it caught on. Other doctors began using Dr. Wagner's protocol, injecting countless asylum patients with malaria, again, likely without their knowledge or consent. This research found that about half the patients injected with this ickiness did see at least somewhat of a reduction in syphilis symptoms after the treatment, but about 15% of those treated also died from the disease. One patient who was residing in the big asylum in Oregon, in the States, reported that during his stay, at least 4 out of every 5 patients were sick in bed with, yeah, you guessed it. So sure, cure one thing, cause harm with another, infect everybody. No wonder this went out of regular medical practice. Did y'all know that branding and spinning were common treatments? So the history of mental health treatment is rife with horrifying and tumultuous treatments. One of the many brutal methods asylum medics used to attempt to treat their prisoners included spinning and branding. Yeah. So what was spinning? Well, this treatment involved either strapping patients to large wheels that were rotated at high speeds or suspending them from a frame that would then be swung around. I have no idea why anybody anywhere thought this would help the mentally ill, aside from, I guess, making them upchuck. But that doesn't do anything unless you've got nausea, which, hi. Branding is exactly what it sounds like. Patients would be burned with hot irons in the belief that it would bring them to their senses. Sure, yes, these treatments did eventually die off, but then they were replaced by other horrifying treatments. We're talking lobotomies, electric shock therapy. Honestly, I feel like I'd rather be branded than get electric shock therapy. What about you? Or lobotomy? Here's a doozy. Patients often took their own lives after being released. Unsurprisingly, given the heinous and utterly ineffective treatments practiced at the time, the few lucky patients who were able to escape, allowed to leave an asylum, were no healthier than when they entered. No actual care was given to a specific patient's needs or issues. They were instead just forced to perform the role of a healthy person to escape the hell on earth that existed within the asylum walls. For those who were truly mentally ill before they entered, this was a recipe for disaster. The horrors they witnessed and endured inside asylums only made their conditions worse. Thanks to actual psychiatric science, we now know that the time immediately after discharge for an inpatient facility is the most dangerous time for many patients. End-of-life risk is unusually high when patients are out of a controlled setting and reintegrate into the outside world, and abruptly at that. One study found that women were 246 times more likely to die within the first week of discharge from a psychiatric institution, with men being 102 times more likely. Given the ignorance of this fact around Victorian times and the deplorable treatment folks received, one wonders how many poor souls took their lives after getting the heck out of there. Let's call this next nifty little fact multi-purpose booze. Beer was an almost shockingly important part of asylum life, and Niall McRae of the Institute of Psychiatry in London says that asylum staff even had part of their wages paid in the stuff. British asylums gave their patients a daily ration of beer, with extra rations given to those who worked on the asylum grounds in some capacity. Most asylums even had their own brew houses, and they tended to make light beer for daily drinking, and extra beer and cider were served to patient workers when it was time to harvest the summer's crops. The practice did fall out of fashion when the temperance movement kicked into high gear, but booze wasn't just for daily diets and rewarding work well done. It was medicinal. Booze in the Victorian era was prescribed for all kinds of things, and asylums used it, particularly stout and brandy, as part of a prescription for those diagnosed as melancholic. According to archival documents saved by St. Joseph's Regional Mental Health Care Centre in London, Ontario, medicinal booze and spirits were a regular part of the budget. In 1874, they spent a reported $1,850 on spirits, wine, and beer, and when that number is adjusted for inflation, it's a whopping $40,000 $1,700 in today's money, roughly. It was commonly used as a sedative, but when attitudes began to shift, many patients were being taken off alcohol instead of being encouraged to use it. Yeah, I can think of more than a few folks from my hometown who would definitely consider boozy beverages medicinal, but I'll pass. I'm not a big drinker. Nowadays, the vast majority of patients in mental health institutions are there at their own request or checked in under extreme circumstances for their safety and for the general public's. But sadly, way back when, that wasn't as true. The laws of the era allowed people to be involuntarily committed by their loved ones with little to no evidence of medical necessity required. Even worse, mental health issues weren't actually necessary to seek an involuntary commitment. The history books are full of women who were committed to asylums for defying their husbands, practicing a different religion, and other marital issues. If your husband wanted to be rid of you, it was that easy. Bleep and terrifying to think about it from a woman's perspective. Young humans were not spared, by the way, from the horrors of involuntary commitment. Families were able to purchase confinement for descendants who were disabled or naturally unruly that they just didn't want to deal with raising. Great, so I would have been doomed from birth. My family isn't well off, but ADHD. Young people could also be committed because of issues like self-pleasure, which was documented in a New Orleans case back in 1883, because back in the day that was criminal. Not going to go into detail, but I think that would have dinged a couple of my friends. Given that only 27% of asylum patients at the turn of the 20th century were in the asylum for a year or less, many of these involuntary committed patients were spending large portions of their lives or their entire lives in mental hospitals. So awful. Did y'all know that asylums doubled as tourist traps? Yes, I shouldn't be shocked with everything I know about circus and sideshow history, but like, jeepers. Starting in the latter half of the 18th century, progressive politicians and social reformers encouraged the building of massive asylums for the treatment of the mentally ill, who before that were like, let's do them at home or good luck. So the conventional health wisdom of the era dictated that peace, beauty, and tranquility were necessary elements for the successful treatment of mental illness, and that concept led to the construction of elaborate gardens, beautiful manicured grounds, all around the little asylums. The asylums themselves were often rather grand buildings with beautiful architecture, all the better to facilitate treatment. However, this attention to the beauty of the buildings and grounds led to a lovely little side effect: asylum tourism, which was a favorite pastime of the rich and influential. Just, let's go visit the asylum, honey. Which, what can you do here? Well, we can walk the grounds with the patients, appreciate the natural beauty, gawk at all the poor souls. Despite being these grand, beautiful, massive facilities, a lot of the inside of these state-run asylums were overcrowded and filthy. Thanks to the relative ease of involuntarily committing somebody, asylums were pretty full after opening their doors, viewing the mentally ill and otherwise committed as prisoners more so than patients or people. Kind of led to a general disinterest in the well-being of the inmates. The culmination of these factors was cramming countless patients into small rooms at every turn. In one facility, sleeping rooms were only 7 feet by 14 feet, with as many as 10 people being forced to sleep in each room. Patients were often confined to these rooms for long hours, with dumbwaiters delivering food and necessities to ensure that they couldn't escape. While the facades and grounds of the asylums were often beautiful and grand, the insides, they reflected how the society of the era viewed the mentally ill. The interiors were bleak, they were overcrowded, they were disgusting. Yes, the outside was beautiful and meant for the joy of taxpayers and tourists, but not those who were condemned to live within. Also, if you lived there, you didn't have privacy. You would be routinely stripped and checked for diseases with no consideration given to any personal qualms. At all times, you were viewed as more of a prisoner than somebody who was sick in need of aid. Also, mealtime? Yeah, have fun. Also, bathing, that's a form of treatment. It's going to be conducted by a lot of people in an open area. There's no privacy there. Given that, yes, this was the time before the creation of a lot of healthcare privacy laws, yeah, anybody's going to be told about what's going on with you. So let's say you were committed by your husband. Well, he's going to find out about your condition, the treatment, everything. There's no secrecy. With the pervasive social stigma towards mental illness in the era, this lack of privacy was pretty harmful. Ooh, let's go back to mealtime stuff for a moment. So a lot of patients had mandated special diets, and not in a, if you have ADHD, you should avoid food coloring kind of way. Don't look at me. People with epilepsy, who were typically committed to asylums rather than being treated in hospitals, were subjected to extremely bland diets, as any heavy, spicy, or awkward to digest food was thought to upset their constitution and worsen their symptoms. Yeah, last I heard, nowadays, treating epilepsy is not a one-size-fits-all situation. One asylum director fervently held the belief that eggs were a vital part of a mentally ill person's diet and reported that his asylum went through over 17 dozen eggs daily for only 125 patients. I'd rather upchuck, thanks. A woman who went undercover at an asylum said she was only given tea, bread with rancid butter, and 5 prunes for each meal, because apparently starvation's the ultimate cure. Alright folks, we're going to end today by talking about the thousands of letters that were written by the inmates but never delivered. Yes, it's tough to know what really truly goes on behind closed doors to the outside world, but fortunately many of the patients committed to asylum life were not only literate, they did write extensively on their experiences there. They wrote about their care, their treatment, that's how we know about all this heinous stuff, and oftentimes they wrote about why they didn't belong. They wrote about how their families sent them there. They wrote about how they wanted to get out, and they wrote these just heartbreaking pleas to everybody on the outside. And then they'd wait. And they'd wait for answers that were never gonna come. And not because their friends and family didn't care about them, but because their letters never got delivered. All these letters were intercepted and read by asylum staff, and any of them that were found to be in any way inappropriate for reading outside asylum walls were kept and stored in an archive, or burned, all without patients knowing that their messages never reached the intended recipients. Breaks my heart. And that's it for me once again, folks. I've been Alexa, your resident emo girly. See y'all next time I buzz in over here at Bumblebee.